It's very easy to get sucked into this game of life we all play, to forget that this whole thing has been completely made up, invented by those who came before. And I don't just mean the obvious things such as our education and occupations, I mean literally everything. Let's use our basic needs, for example. We rely on businesses such as supermarkets for our food, governments for our supply of water, and these days we need both to buy our homes. You know, get a loan from a bank, which is of course a business, and then pay rates to the government.
God, I love it.
That's food, water, and shelter, the three most basic needs for life that we on our own would not be able to satisfy. Because the vast majority of us rely on businesses and governments simply to survive, we in turn give such organizations an immense amount of power. Think about it for a second. If all businesses were to close tomorrow, how would you get your food? No supermarkets, no dairies, no fruit and veggie stores, no food conveniently packed and ready on shelves for you to purchase. Your only option to hunt and gather. Would you even know where to start? Now, I'm not trying to say that the convenience business and government organizations have granted us is inherently bad. I myself use both to fulfill my basic needs just like you. What I am trying to highlight is that the normally accepted way we live is only normal because of the way society was set up by those who came before. It was set up by people experiencing an entirely different time. People who thought and acted completely different to the generations who came after, with each generation moving further and further away from our founding fathers' perspective. It's rather difficult to pin down when exactly the society we know today was created, but there are a few significant events we can look at. One of the major ones being the British monarchy's reign. This would take us all the way back over 12,000 years to 871 AD when King Alfred was crowned the first monarch of the British royal family. After 37 generations and 61 monarchs, we arrive today at Queen Elizabeth II. It's really quite astonishing how long the royal family has managed to defend their claim to power simply through a birthright. This unborn fetus shall be king of all. Although today the British Empire is pretty much non-existent, only restricted to a few small island territories such as Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. The real power of the British Empire today exists through the formation of the Commonwealth, which is really just a memory of the empire. The Commonwealth was founded on the 11th of December 1931 and today contains 54 countries, most of which were at one point a controlled British territory. These 54 countries spread from Africa to the Caribbean and include 2.4 billion people. That's almost 1/3 of the entire world's population. At the head of this Commonwealth sits, you guessed it, the royal family, currently Queen Elizabeth II. This foxy lady right here. Now, after spending hours researching, I still can't see any real reason why this Commonwealth actually needs to exist. But according to their website, the purpose of the Commonwealth is to protect the environment, boost trade and the economy, support democracy, and develop society and young people. To me, these all seem like simple buzzwords with no real meaning other than to sound impactful. Kind of like McDonald's promoting 100% real beef to try and convince you their burgers can't be that bad. In truth, the Commonwealth, or in other words, the Queen, has no real power. Each country functions independently of the Queen with their own elected governors and laws. The Queen's power is really a facade. She may have her face on your dollar bill, but in reality, she has no control. But this is exactly how the royal family uphold their prestige. They must appear to be better, more important than us, to stop the public asking questions. Questions like, what is the purpose of this royal family? How is it fair that someone can simply be born and granted power? It's funny that one of the purposes on the Commonwealth website is support democracy, when the whole British monarchy system is based on birthright, which is a lot more similar to communism than democracy. Okay, so if the Queen doesn't have any real legal power, how could the monarchy, how could the British Empire be responsible for the society we see today? Well, to understand this, we need to go back a little bit. Remember when I mentioned at one point most of the countries who are now in the Commonwealth were a functioning British territory? Well, I live in one of these countries, being New Zealand. This cheeky wee fella. So I will use us as an example. Before European settlers discovered New Zealand in 1642, this country was called Aotearoa, which is Maori for the land of the long white cloud. and was inhabited by these indigenous Maori people. But for some reason, when I search on Google when was New Zealand discovered, results would point to the first European settlers, when in truth this country had been discovered centuries prior by Maori who arrived in waves of waka voyages somewhere around the 1300s. It appears the history we are taught today only begins when Europeans meddled. These Maori people lived in small tribes and villages located in harbours near the sea and later moved inland to valleys suitable for agriculture. Maori people have a rich culture filled with mythical creatures, spiritual awareness and magical stories. At the heart of this culture was the understanding that humans were a part of nature. Maori people saw themselves in a sacred relationship with our natural world. Thus, the use of natural resources was conducted under strict regimes with the utmost respect. Maori lived in Aotearoa undisturbed by outside influence for at least 400 years. Over this time, their culture, their respect for nature, for mana, meaning spirit, only grew. And then along came the Europeans. The British Empire first discovered New Zealand with the arrival of Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642, during which Tasman experienced a brief encounter with Maori people. To say the least, this didn't go very well. The Dutch left and Maori people were once again left alone for another 100 years, until 1769, with the arrival of James Cook.
This fucking scallywag.
And this was a totally different story to Tasman. Cook's official mission was scientific. His job was to explore the Pacific and record the transit of Venus. However, he also had a secret objective. Many Europeans believed there was a giant continent in the southern hemisphere to balance out the landmass of the north. It can even be seen here sketched on old maps called Terra Australis Non Ready yourself. Cook's orders were to try and discover this land and claim at least part of it for Great Britain.
The script thing's kind of long, you can read it if you want, but to be honest, it doesn't really add much.
Cook made 3 voyages into the Pacific. He of course never discovered the southern continent as it did not exist. However, he did manage to map New Zealand, Aotearoa. During his first voyage, with the help of a Tahitian translator, Cook managed to mostly negotiate peacefully with Maori and began setting up early systems of trade while trying to better understand the Maori people.
I just don't get you, cousin.
However, his intentions were not all that pure. During his first voyages, there were multiple Maori people shot by Cook and his crew due to trivial misunderstandings.
Along with this, towards the end of his first voyage, Cook walked up a hill in Queen Charlotte Sound, raised the Union Jack, and claimed possession of the surrounding area for Great Britain.
By the end of his second voyage, Cook was busy documenting New Zealand's natural resources to exploit for the benefit of Great Britain and its European citizens.
I need more, give me more.
It's quite clear that from the get-go, James Cook's key goal was to make steps towards the colonization of the Maori people. Of course, all of this was kept out of view from the indigenous Maori people. Cook's third voyage to New Zealand would be his last, as he was killed during a dispute. However, he left a lasting impression on Aotearoa. He introduced animals such as pigs and vegetables such as the potato, as well as diseases such as tuberculosis and gonorrhea. The pigs and especially the potato became major food sources for the Maori people, while the diseases caused infertility and death. But this was only the beginning. The second wave of European settlers arrived in the 1800s and were mostly whalers and sailors who set up bases around the coast. These settlers began trading food with Maori, which eventually led to trade between New Zealand and Australia.
Alright, this boat isn't actually quite proportioned right. They weren't actually half the size of New Zealand.
In exchange for food, Maori would receive new technology such as clothing, tools, and weapons, the most revolutionary being muskets. Of course, all this new technology influenced Maori culture greatly, but nothing quite as much as the muskets. Musket wars spread between Maori tribes who would seek to invade those who did not yet have access to these new weapons. Eventually, these wars spread all over New Zealand. The musket wars ended in the 1830s once all tribes had access to guns and there were no more easy victories to be had. During this time, a combination of war and new diseases wiped out 20 to 30% of the Maori population. These wars also caused Maori for the first time ever to rely on outside influence. Without the British, the Maori had no access to muskets. This created an alliance between Maori and British tribes. During the late 1830s, Maori were still very much in control. The Maori people outnumbered the British 40-1 and made decisions of where Europeans could live, who they traded with, and how they should behave.
You're a naughty, naughty boy.
Some Europeans even began settling in Maori villages and lived according to Maori tradition. It appeared the future could bring a partnership between Maori and the British. A partnership where the British would integrate into the Maori society, into the Maori way of life. Of course, this is not what happened. Over the next 60 years, Europeans would infiltrate Aotearoa and dominate the Maori, forcing them to integrate into European society. This was all due to a document known as the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed on the 6th of February 1840. This treaty was sold to the Maori as a means to regulate British and other outside influence by granting Maori legal authority over their own land and partly sharing this responsibility with Great Britain. This would be accomplished through a partnership between Aotearoa and Great Britain. Now, all of this sounds fair in theory, but what actually occurred is entirely different. The Treaty of Waitangi was rushed and written by British authority in only a few days, and then had to be translated into Te Reo Māori so the chiefs could understand it. This translation was done in a single night. The following day, the treaty was read to about 500 Māori people. Initially, there was concern among some of the chiefs who feared this document could lead to the British taking complete control of Aotearoa. However, after some debate, most of the chiefs gave in and signed the document known as the Treaty of Waitangi. This document was then sent around the country and signed by a further 500 Māori leaders, which made this treaty an official piece of New Zealand and British law. Almost immediately, issues arose. All the documents that were signed by the Māori were, for obvious reasons, the Māori translated version of the treaty. Now, this is important because, as it turns out, the Māori and English version of the treaty were different. One of the most significant differences was that the Māori version promised the chiefs Tino Rangatira-tanga. Look, I struggle to roll my R's, okay? Don't come for me. Which is loosely translated to mean self-governorship, while the English version stated the chiefs ceded sovereignty to the crown. In other words, the crown, the British Empire, would take control. The only reason Māori signed the treaty was because they believed that the shadow of the land will go to the Queen, while the substance would remain with them. Māori thought the governor's authority would be limited to European land and people. However, the English version said the crown was going to take complete control. And this is exactly what happened. Initially, the British did not have the military, political, or economic power to completely take control of Aotearoa. That is until 1858. Only 18 years after the signing of the treaty, Europeans would begin to outnumber the Māori population and exercise control through force. At this point, Māori were well aware that the treaty they had signed was not what they thought and began to rebel. The Europeans retaliated by sending an enormous army from Great Britain to New Zealand. In 1863, Great Britain threatened to confiscate all Māori land unless Māori pledged allegiance to Queen Victoria.
The fuck you mean, cuz?
Of course, Māori refused, which sparked wars that would last decades. The Māori, being experts at warfare, put up an impressive fight and won many battles against all odds. However, Great Britain had manpower and technology on their side that, in the long run, Māori could not possibly challenge. Great Britain was eventually successful and began confiscating Māori land. Sacred hills were turned into quarries, ancient burial sites were demolished, and archaeological remains were destroyed. This caused not only an immense ecological impact, but also threatened the Māori culture and their spiritual nature. Over the years, Europeans would continue claiming Aotearoa as their own, and eventually Aotearoa would turn into New Zealand that we know today.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Nah, it's just fucking New Zealand.
This is the story of how New Zealand was colonized and the society we know today was set up. If you look at the countless other territories that were one day colonized by Great Britain, you will find a similar story. A story which involves forcefully stripping natives of their heritage to make way for the British way of life, which today is known as the Western world. This Western way ignores all spiritual truths, believes nature and human beings are separate entities, and is busy destroying all cultures who think otherwise, while also disrespecting the earth which we all share. Maybe it's time to embrace a new way of life. Just some food for thought. Thank you guys for watching. Peace.